question is whether 517.17 applies to a 4-story building with 8 tenants, supplied by a 1200 AMP 480/277 service, requiring ground fault protection of equipment and the service disconnect per 230.95. The intended use is strictly doctors' offices, not an ambulatory care center. It has no critical branch or emergency branch. It has no generator. There is no anesthesia. There is no dialysis. There is no surgery. Just doctors' offices. Portions of each tenant are exempt from 517 Part B per 517.10. Bone, but the exam rooms are required to meet 517 Part B per 517.10. Does 517.17 apply? The building is classified as Uniform Building Code Occupancy Class B, Business, and not Occupancy Class I, Healthcare. Based on the information provided, several factors suggest that 517.17 may apply. Firstly, the exam rooms are required to meet 517 Part B. This implies the building contains spaces that fall under the scope of 517, including the exam rooms. Secondly, although the building is classified as business, the presence of exam rooms suggests that portions of the building may also be considered healthcare occupancy. Thirdly, the ground fault protection of equipment requirement under 230.95 is typically associated with healthcare occupancies. It is recommended to contact the authority having jurisdiction for clarification. This will provide the most definitive answer and avoid any potential issues during inspection and approval. Based on the information provided, it is likely that 517.17 may apply to the building, even though it is not classified as a healthcare occupancy. It is strongly advised to contact the authority having jurisdiction to confirm the requirements and ensure compliance before proceeding with the design. 517.17 addresses ground fault protection in healthcare facilities. It states that, in addition to the requirements of 230.95, ground fault protection for equipment shall be provided for healthcare facilities. The design and performance characteristics shall be in accordance with 517.17 A and B. 517.17 covers the feeder or service ground fault protection. When ground fault protection is first installed on a feeder or service, there shall be a performance test. The test shall be conducted in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions, and a written record shall be made and shall be available to the authority having jurisdiction. 517.17b covers additional ground fault protection requirements. In addition to the requirements of 230.95, ground fault protection shall be provided for healthcare facilities. This additional ground fault protection shall be provided for all feeders and services. The ground fault protection shall comply with the requirements of 230.95 except as modified by 517.17 bone through 3. 517.17 bone covers the selection of overcurrent protective devices. The overcurrent protective devices shall be selected to minimize nuisance tripping of the ground fault protection. 517.17b2 covers the coordination of ground fault protection. The ground fault protection shall be coordinated to minimize the extent of a power outage due to a ground fault. 517.17b3 covers the testing of ground fault protection. The ground fault protection shall be tested in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions, and a written record shall be made and shall be available to the authority having jurisdiction. The question revolves around whether the presence of doctors' offices, specifically with exam rooms falling under 517 Part B, necessitates adherence to 517.17, even if the building's primary occupancy classification is business rather than healthcare. 230.95 of the National Electrical Code mandates ground fault protection of equipment for 480/277 volt systems where the service disconnect exceeds 1000 amps. This is independent of the occupancy type. However, 517.17 adds another layer of ground fault protection specifically for healthcare facilities. The key determination hinges on whether the doctor's offices with exam rooms constitute a healthcare facility as defined or interpreted by the relevant electrical codes and standards, and more importantly, by the authority having jurisdiction. The authority having jurisdiction holds the ultimate decision-making power regarding code interpretation and enforcement. Their stance dictates whether 517.17 applies regardless of the building's overall occupancy classification. Several factors need consideration. Firstly, the specific activities conducted in the exam rooms. If these activities involve procedures or treatments that pose a heightened risk of electrical shock or disruption of electrical service could compromise patient safety, it strengthens the argument for considering the exam rooms as part of a healthcare facility. Secondly, the extent to which the exam rooms are integrated with other medical services. If the doctor's offices are part of a larger medical complex or share resources with other healthcare providers, it might lead to a broader interpretation of healthcare occupancy. Thirdly, the National Electrical Code definitions. The National Electrical Code defines specific terms related to healthcare facilities, and these definitions should be carefully reviewed to determine if the doctor's offices meet the criteria. Since portions of each tenant are exempt from 517 Part B per 517.10, it suggests that some areas within the doctor's offices do not require the enhanced electrical safety measures of healthcare facilities. However, the exam rooms are required to meet 517 Part B per 517.10, which indicates that these rooms are subject to the stricter requirements. The fact that the local authority having jurisdiction would not require 517.17 based on the occupancy rating is a significant factor. However, it's essential to remember that the authority having jurisdiction for the actual job location has the final say. Therefore, contacting them is crucial to obtain a definitive answer. It's possible that the authority having jurisdiction may have specific local amendments or interpretations that differ from the general understanding of the code. In summary, while the building is classified as business occupancy, the presence of exam rooms subject to 517 Part B raises the possibility that 517.17 applies. The final determination rests with the authority having jurisdiction, and their interpretation should be sought before proceeding with the electrical design. Given that ground fault protection of equipment is already required per 230.95, the additional requirements of 517.17 would likely focus on the coordination and testing of the ground fault protection system to ensure its reliability and effectiveness in a healthcare setting. The electrical design should account for the potential application of 517.17 by providing for the necessary testing and coordination features. This proactive approach can help avoid costly rework if the authority having jurisdiction ultimately requires compliance with 517.17. 517.10 states that the provisions of Part B shall apply to patient care areas in all healthcare facilities. 517.10 states that areas of a healthcare facility that are not patient care areas shall be permitted to be wired using wiring methods as specified in Chapters 1 through 4 of the National Electrical Code. It is important to distinguish between the general requirements for ground fault protection of equipment in 230.95 and the specific requirements for healthcare facilities outlined in 517.17. 230.95 is triggered by the size of the service, specifically over 1000 amps on a 480/277 volt system. It aims to protect equipment from damage due to ground faults. 517.17, on the other hand, is occupancy-based. It applies to healthcare facilities and aims to protect both equipment and patients by providing a more sensitive and coordinated ground fault protection system. Even though the building is classified as a business occupancy, the presence of exam rooms that fall under the scope of 517 Part B suggests that these areas are considered patient care areas. Therefore, the authority having jurisdiction may require compliance with 517.17 in those specific areas. When contacting the authority having jurisdiction, be prepared to provide detailed information about the activities conducted in the exam rooms, the types of equipment used, and the potential risks to patients. Also, be sure to inquire about any local amendments or interpretations of the National Electrical Code that may affect the application of 517.17. If the authority having jurisdiction determines that 517.17 applies, the electrical design will need to incorporate the additional requirements, which may include more sensitive ground fault relays, selective coordination of ground fault protection devices, and specific testing procedures. Consider the potential implications of a ground fault in the exam rooms. Would it disrupt critical equipment or procedures? Could it pose a safety risk to patients or staff? The answers to these questions can help justify the need for enhanced ground fault protection. The decision of whether to apply 517.17 is not always clear-cut and often depends on the specific circumstances and the interpretation of the authority having jurisdiction. It is always best to err on the side of caution and seek clarification from the authority having jurisdiction to ensure compliance and patient safety. The key takeaways are: firstly, the presence of exam rooms subject to 517 Part B raises the possibility of 517.17 applying. Secondly, the authority having jurisdiction has the final say on code interpretation and enforcement. Thirdly, it is crucial to contact the authority having jurisdiction to obtain a definitive answer and avoid potential issues. The building occupancy classification is business, but the usage of the space matters too. The exam rooms have a purpose that falls under healthcare. While the entire building doesn't qualify as a healthcare facility, the exam rooms within it do because they are utilized as such. It all comes down to the authority having jurisdiction and what they dictate in this case. 517.17 requires ground fault protection for equipment in healthcare facilities, which is in addition to the standard ground fault protection requirements in 230.95. The additional protection is intended to minimize the risk of electrical shock and fire in patient care areas. The requirements of 517.17 include: firstly, ground fault protection for all feeders and services. Secondly, the ground fault protection must be coordinated to minimize the extent of a power outage due to a ground fault. Thirdly, the ground fault protection must be tested regularly to ensure that it is functioning properly. In the context of the doctor's offices, the exam rooms would likely be considered patient care areas, and therefore subject to the requirements of 517.17. This means that the electrical system in the exam rooms would need to be designed and installed to provide enhanced ground fault protection. The potential for misinterpretation highlights the importance of clear communication with the authority having jurisdiction. By proactively engaging with the authority having jurisdiction and presenting a well-reasoned argument, it may be possible to reach a mutually agreeable solution that ensures both compliance and cost-effectiveness. Remember that the goal of electrical codes is to ensure safety, and the authority having jurisdiction plays a crucial role in interpreting and enforcing those codes. When in doubt, always seek clarification from the authority having jurisdiction to avoid potential problems down the road. The authority having jurisdiction's interpretation of the code is paramount in determining whether 517.17 applies. The fact that the local authority having jurisdiction, not for the project location, does not require it based on occupancy is informative but not binding. Factors supporting the application of 517.17 include: firstly, the requirement for exam rooms to meet 517 Part B indicates their classification as patient care areas. Secondly, ground fault protection of equipment is often associated with healthcare occupancies due to sensitive equipment and patient safety concerns. Thirdly, the enhanced protection provided by 517.17 could mitigate risks in exam rooms where medical procedures are performed. Factors against the application of 517.17 include: firstly, the building's primary occupancy classification as business suggests it's not a healthcare facility in its entirety. Secondly, portions of tenant spaces are exempt from 517 Part B, indicating not all areas require healthcare-level electrical safety. The suggested approach is to contact the resident authority having jurisdiction for a definitive ruling. This ensures compliance and avoids potential issues during inspection. Be prepared to present a clear rationale for the design and address any concerns they may have. The conclusion is that, given the conflicting factors, the application of 517.17 is uncertain. Contacting the resident authority having jurisdiction is essential for a final determination. Remember to document all communications and decisions for future reference. The decision hinges on the authority having jurisdiction's interpretation of the National Electrical Code, especially regarding what constitutes a healthcare facility and how 517 Part B applies to the exam rooms. Prepare to discuss the specific equipment and procedures in the exam rooms and how electrical safety is being addressed in the design. It's possible the authority having jurisdiction may require additional measures beyond standard commercial practices to align with the intent of 517. Firstly, confirm if the exam rooms are considered patient care areas as defined by the National Electrical Code. Secondly, inquire if the specific medical equipment used in the exam rooms necessitates enhanced ground fault protection. Thirdly, understand the authority having jurisdiction's interpretation of how 517 Part B applies to a business occupancy with designated patient care areas. Consider a design approach that allows for flexibility. If the authority having jurisdiction requires 517.17, ensure the system can accommodate the additional ground fault protection and coordination requirements. If not, the base design should still meet all applicable codes for business occupancy. Ground fault protection is a critical safety feature. It helps to prevent electrical shock and fires by detecting and interrupting ground faults. Ground faults occur when electricity takes an unintended path to ground, such as through a person or a metal object. Ground fault protection devices, such as ground fault circuit interrupters and ground fault relays, are designed to detect these faults and quickly shut off the power. The purpose of ground fault protection is to protect people and equipment from the hazards of electricity. The electrical system should be designed and installed to minimize the risk of ground faults and to provide effective ground fault protection when they do occur. When considering the application of 517.17, it's important to remember that the primary goal is to ensure the safety of patients and staff in healthcare facilities. While the building's occupancy classification is a factor, the specific activities conducted in the exam rooms and the potential risks associated with those activities should be the primary focus. Always consult with qualified electrical professionals and the authority having jurisdiction to ensure that the electrical design meets all applicable codes and standards and provides the necessary level of protection. Ground fault protection is a critical component of electrical safety in healthcare facilities. It is designed to protect patients and staff from electrical shock and fire hazards. 517.17 provides specific requirements for ground fault protection in healthcare facilities, including the need for coordinated ground fault protection systems and regular testing. These requirements are intended to ensure that the ground fault protection system is functioning properly and can effectively protect patients and staff in the event of a ground fault. The key is to have a clear understanding of the applicable codes and standards and to work closely with the authority having jurisdiction to ensure that the electrical design meets all requirements. Ground fault protection works by monitoring the balance of current flowing through the conductors of an electrical circuit. In a properly functioning circuit, the current flowing into the circuit should be equal to the current flowing out. If there is a ground fault, some of the current will leak to ground, creating an imbalance. Ground fault protection devices are designed to detect this imbalance and quickly shut off the power to the circuit, preventing electrical shock and fire hazards. In healthcare facilities, it is especially important to have sensitive and reliable ground fault protection systems due to the presence of vulnerable patients and sensitive medical equipment. 517.17 helps to ensure that these systems are designed and installed to provide the highest level of protection.